You know that person who stays calm when everything falls apart? The one who doesn't panic, doesn't raise their voice, doesn't rush to explain themselves. Yeah, people often mistake that for being cold. But calm like that is rarely natural. It's usually earned. Because people who have been through too much don't react the way others do. They've already seen what real chaos looks like. So the small stuff doesn't impress them anymore. Someone cancels plans last minute. Someone disrespects them. Someone tries to provoke a reaction. Most people explode or spiral. They don't. Not because they don't feel, but because they've learned when reacting costs more than it gives. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people don't want to hear. Pain doesn't just hurt you, it trains you. When you survive situations where emotions were dangerous, where speaking up made things worse, where reacting meant consequences, your nervous system adapts. It becomes efficient, selective, quiet. That's why people who've endured a lot often pause before they speak. They measure words. They scan the room. They read tone before content. They're not overthinking. They're pattern recognizing. Their brain learned early that safety lives in awareness. And this creates something strange. They develop emotional discipline long before most people even realize it exists. They don't chase validation. They don't explain themselves to everyone. They don't beg to be understood. Because at some point, they learned this brutal lesson. Being misunderstood is safer than being exposed. That's why silence becomes their default language. But silence doesn't mean emptiness. It means compression. Everything they feel is happening internally, processed quietly, sorted carefully, stored with intention. You won't see the storm. You'll only see the aftermath, clarity. And that's where the mislabeling starts. They're called distant, cold, unemotional, too serious. What people don't see is the restraint behind that calm. It takes strength not to react. It takes discipline not to lash out. It takes maturity to choose peace when chaos feels familiar. Most people confuse loud emotion with honesty. But the people who've been through too much know something different. Emotion doesn't need volume to be real. In fact, the deepest emotions are often the quietest. Here's another thing no one warns you about. These people become incredibly perceptive. They notice micro changes, a pause half a second too long, a smile that doesn't reach the eyes, a tone that's slightly off. They don't guess. They remember. Because they've lived in environments where reading the room wasn't optional. It was survival. So while others hear words, they hear intention. While others see behavior, they see patterns. That's why they often feel older than their age, like they skipped stages everyone else got to enjoy. And yes, there's a cost to that. They grieve a version of themselves that never fully existed. The version that trusted without calculation. The version that didn't rehearse conversations. The version that didn't need to stay alert. They miss a softness they had to trade for stability. And here's the part people rarely understand. These individuals don't crave chaos. They crave control. Not dominance, control. Control over reactions. Control over environment. Control over what they allow to affect them. That's why they build routines. That's why they value discipline. That's why consistency feels safer than excitement. Discipline becomes their replacement for unpredictability. While others chase motivation, they rely on structure. While others wait to feel ready, they move anyway. While others need emotional alignment, they work through resistance. And that's why they often outperform people who had easier lives. Not because they're better, but because they're trained. They know progress isn't dramatic. It's repetitive, quiet, unseen. They understand growth doesn't announce itself, it accumulates. And this creates another contradiction. They can handle massive uncertainty with surprising calm. Job changes, relocations, life resets. But they'll overthink small details. Why? Because they learned early that big disasters come without warning, so they control what they can. That's not weakness, that's adaptation. And then there's the humor. Dark, sharp, sometimes uncomfortable. Not because they're insensitive, but because humor gives them power. When you can laugh at pain, it stops owning you. Every joke is proof they survived something that tried to silence them. In relationships, this gets complicated. They're loyal to a fault. They'll show up when it matters. They'll carry others without complaining. But ask them to depend on someone, to be fully vulnerable. That's harder. Because closeness once came with consequences. Because relying on others once meant disappointment, loss, or danger. So they learn to be self-sufficient, strong, independent. And yes, lonely.
They don't fear being alone.
They fear being unsafe. That's the difference. And here's the part that matters most. People who've been through too much don't want admiration. They want peace. They don't need applause. They need predictability. They don't need excitement. They need stability. They've seen what life looks like without those things. So when they choose discipline, silence, routine, and boundaries, it's not because they lack emotion. It's because they've felt too much. They understand strength isn't loud. It's consistent. It's getting up when no one is watching, doing the work without praise, holding yourself together even when no one would blame you for falling apart. And maybe that's the real psychology here. People who've gone through too much don't just survive. They refine. Their pain becomes precision. Their chaos becomes control. Their fear becomes awareness. They become the kind of people who don't need to prove anything, because they already know what they're capable of. So if you ever meet someone who seems unshaken by things that rattle everyone else, someone who stays composed when emotions run high, someone who chooses discipline over drama, understand this. They didn't become that way by accident. They were shaped by storms, and they learned how to stand in the wind without breaking. That's not coldness. That's mastery.